What you're watching right now is not a random flare-up, and it's not just another Middle East headline. It's the output of a machine, a system with rules so consistent that if you understand the gears, you can forecast the next move before it happens. Here's the hard claim, stated cleanly. When a superpower builds a forward military perimeter faster than it can sustain the political consensus behind it, and when its global system is already operating under extreme financial leverage, then a single regional crisis doesn't stay regional. It becomes a credibility test, and credibility tests, historically, don't end with polite press releases. They end with escalation pressure. And the reason I'm saying that so confidently is because the numbers underneath this aren't opinions. They're structural. As of the third quarter of 2025, the Institute of International Finance reported global debt near $346 trillion, around 310% of global GDP. That's not a fun fact. That's a stability constraint. When leverage is that high, leaders become allergic to shocks, markets become jumpy, and every geopolitical incident has a larger financial shadow. Now, put that financial reality against today's military geometry. This is openly mapped and discussed by major institutions, including the Council on Foreign Relations. And Iran's leadership has been explicit about what that footprint means in a worst-case scenario. In this escalation cycle, Iranian officials have warned that if the U.S. attacks Iran, Iran would strike U.S. bases in the region, framing them as direct retaliatory targets. So when you see viral titles like Iran targeted 20 U.S. bases, missiles are ready, you have to be disciplined. Targeted may mean threatened, mapped, designated, placed in the retaliatory basket. Not necessarily that missiles are airborne right now. But here's the verifiable core. Iran is messaging that U.S. regional bases are part of the retaliation equation if conflict expands. And once bases become the centerpiece of deterrence, they also become the centerpiece of retaliation. That's not ideology, that's mechanics. Now I'm going to do something most coverage refuses to do. I'm going to give you the mechanism, the repeatable pattern that shows up across centuries. Different flags, same system. Think of it as 4 stages. First, a dominant power builds order after chaos. It creates rules, trade flow, security guarantees, and logistics. It becomes the default provider of stability. The system is born. Second, the system expands beyond what the original political and economic compact can comfortably sustain. Commitments multiply. Supply lines lengthen. Exceptions become permanent. Temporary deployments become the new normal. The perimeter grows faster than the consensus that funds it. Third, rivals stop competing on the dominant power's strengths and start exploiting the weak points. Choke points, proxies, domestic politics, energy corridors, and most importantly, fixed installations. The dominant power must defend more places, more often, while patience at home erodes. Fourth, a trigger arrives. Sometimes it's dramatic. Sometimes it's stupidly small. But because the structure is already strained, the trigger cascades into escalation. The war, the rupture, the currency shock, the regime shift, whatever it is, feels sudden in the headlines, but it was preloaded into the system. If you understand this, you stop being surprised, you start forecasting. Now let's prove it with history, quickly, but with enough detail that you can see the pattern lock into place. Case 1, the late Roman Empire. Rome's early imperial order is the setup. Roads, garrisons, administrative control, predictable trade routes. Rome becomes the system because Rome reduces chaos and enables commerce. Then comes overextension. Frontiers expand. Obligations multiply across Britannia, the Rhine, the Danube, and the East. The costs aren't just soldiers, they're forts, grain, transport, infrastructure, and constant readiness. Political competition inside the empire increases the temptation to buy loyalty. This is where the financial gear turns. When commitments exceed what taxation and productive growth can cover, states find invisible funding. In Rome's case, coinage debasement becomes a tool. Stretch the currency, fund the perimeter. Then crisis. Debasement corrodes trust. Prices rise. Soldiers demand higher pay because money buys less. The state must spend more to get the same stability. Meanwhile, adversaries and migrating groups don't attack Rome where Rome is strongest. They probe borders, exploit gaps, and pressure weak points. Rome becomes reactive. It spends more simply to avoid losing ground. Then, the inevitable outcome, fragmentation and loss of control. Not one day, a structural break. The perimeter becomes too expensive to hold with stable trust. The system breaks where it's weakest. Case 2, Germany after World War I. Setup. After 1918, the old European order collapses. A new framework is imposed through treaties, most famously the Treaty of Versailles, designed to restrain German power and prevent a repeat war. Overextension. The imposed constraints become politically unsustainable. Reparations, territorial changes, and humiliation create a legitimacy crisis. The The state inherits massive obligations with limited flexibility, and a population that feels the settlement is coercion, not consensus. Crisis. The Weimar government faces extreme stress, and monetary expansion becomes a desperate lever. Hyperinflation destroys savings and social trust. Extremism grows because the center can no longer credibly promise stability. Outside arrangements can temporarily stabilize, but they also create dependency. When global conditions tighten, the scaffolding collapses. Outcome? Political capture by radicals, militarization, and the path toward another catastrophic war. Again, the trigger events matter less than the structural truth. When legitimacy and economic stability collapse together, the system becomes primed for conflict. Case 3, the United States in the 1970s. Setup. After World War II, the U.S. anchors an international order. Bretton Woods creates a stable monetary framework. U.S. security guarantees expand across Europe and key regions. The system works because U.S. productive power and political cohesion are immense. Overextension, costs rise, Vietnam strains budgets and politics, domestic programs expand, and global demand for dollars outpaces U.S. gold reserves. The system contains a contradiction: fixed convertibility with expanding issuance. Crisis. In 1971, the Nixon administration ends gold convertibility, the Nixon shock breaking the old constraint. The decade brings stagflation and oil shocks. Energy becomes a geopolitical lever. When supply is constrained, the entire industrial economy feels it. Alliances strain, policy becomes reactive. Outcome. The world shifts into a new regime: floating currencies, heavier reliance on credibility, and deeper entanglement between Middle East security and global economic stability. The system survives, but the perimeter becomes more complex, and the role of forward posture becomes even more central. 3 different eras, same gears, build order, expand commitments, strain legitimacy or funding, face a crisis where weak points are exploited, then pay the bill. Now we apply the same pattern to the present, step by step. No slogans, no panic, just cold system logic. The setup is obvious. Over decades, the U.S. built a regional security posture designed for deterrence and rapid response. Bases, naval assets, partner training, missile defense, logistics nodes. This is not hidden, it's mapped and discussed. That posture worked for a long time because it imposed costs and shaped outcomes, and because several regional actors preferred U.S. presence to alternative hegemons. Setup? Check. Now the overextension phase. This is where people get confused because they think overextension means too many troops. Not necessarily. Strategic overextension is about commitments and tripwires. It's about having too many obligations that must be honored to preserve credibility. The Middle East has not been one conflict. It's been overlapping theaters: maritime security, counterterrorism, partner defense, deterrence against state actors, crisis containment, and now the constantly shifting nuclear and missile negotiation landscape. The posture has to cover multiple contingencies at once. Now put that on top of a global financial system running at extreme leverage. Again, nearly $346 trillion in global debt, about 310% of world GDP per IIF reporting. High leverage doesn't cause a missile crisis, but it changes how states behave. It increases the incentive to avoid shocks, to project stability, to defend credibility, and to control narratives. Because in leveraged systems, volatility becomes expensive, and expensive volatility becomes political. Overextension. Verified. Now, crisis and loss of control, the stage we are actively flirting with. Rivals adapt. They don't need to outspend the U.S. They don't need aircraft carriers to create leverage. They need asymmetry. In modern war, asymmetry means missiles, drones, cyber operations, proxies, and choke points. And here's the key detail for retention, because this is where the entire story tightens. Fixed installations are power, but fixed installations are also coordinates: bases, runways, depots, fuel farms. These are predictable nodes in a missile age, and predictability becomes a vulnerability. That is why Iran's posture and messaging matters. Reuters reporting in early February described the diplomatic track through Oman, and also the underlying fear of military escalation, with Iranian officials warning about threats and pressure while talks proceed. Then, crucially, in the same escalation climate, Reuters reported new U.S. maritime guidance for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz, warning U.S. flagged ships to avoid Iranian territorial waters as safely possible, advising verbal refusal to boarding requests, but not to resist if boarded, explicitly to avoid escalation. That's not normal peacetime posture. That's a system managing a choke point under tension. Now link the choke point to the base network. When a rival signals it can pressure shipping lanes and threaten regional bases in response to an attack, it's not just talking about fighting. It's talking about leverage. And Iran's messaging has been consistent. If attacked, It frames strikes on U.S. bases in the region as retaliation, while attempting to separate those bases from the host countries politically. That framing is designed to complicate the response and widen pressure points. Now ask yourself a simple question. What happens to deterrence when retaliation becomes credible? Deterrence changes shape. The question stops being, can the U.S. hit Iran? Of course it can. The question becomes, can the U.S. act without absorbing a retaliation sequence that forces escalation to preserve credibility? That's the trap. And once a system enters a credibility trap, leaders don't have full freedom anymore. They have incentive rails. If the guarantor does nothing after a challenge, credibility devalues. Alliances wobble, deterrence weakens, rivals get bolder. If the guarantor responds sharply, escalation risk rises. Markets react, energy premiums climb, shipping risk changes, domestic politics harden. So the real battlefield isn't just missiles and runways, it's credibility, the currency that gets issued, spent, defended, and sometimes devalued. And this is the point where most scripts lose retention. They stay abstract. So let's make it concrete. Imagine you are a commander responsible for a major regional hub. You know the site is critical, aircraft rotation, logistics, intelligence, missile defense coordination. You also know that in any retaliation doctrine, that hub becomes symbolically important. Now imagine you're a political leader. You're balancing deterrence with escalation risk. While markets watch oil flows, shipping insurers adjust premiums, allies demand reassurance, and domestic audiences demand strength without endless war. This is not a decision. This is a narrow hallway, and the hallway gets narrower the longer the system stays in stage 3. Now stage 4, the inevitable outcome, does not mean world war tomorrow. It means the system enters an environment where near misses become routine and miscalculation becomes the biggest danger, because in stressed systems, triggers don't need to be large. A drone interception, a proxy strike with ambiguous attribution, a naval boarding incident misread as an attack, a missile launch that turns out to be a test but is read as escalation, a cyber event that looks like sabotage, a political assassination blamed on the wrong actor. In stage 4, the trigger is rarely the cause. It's the spark that finds the fuel that was already poured. And you can already see the system's attempt to manage that risk through diplomacy. Indirect U.S.-Iran talks in Oman, described as a good start, with Washington also pushing to expand the agenda to missiles and regional groups, while Iran resists broadening beyond nuclear issues. Here's the retention hook you need to hold on to. Diplomacy isn't happening because everyone suddenly became friends. Diplomacy is happening because the structure is dangerous. Now, about the 20 bases idea that people keep repeating, you do not need to claim an exact number to understand the reality. The footprint is broad. CFR maps an extensive presence, and other outlets have described at least dozens of sites and facilities in the region, with multiple major hubs considered permanent. So why does 20 stick in people's minds? Because it feels like a manageable map, a list, a set of dots. And that is exactly how retaliation planning works, not as a speech, but as a target deck. Again, this is not a claim that missiles are already en route. This is the structural point. Bases are both strength and liability, and in a missile age, they become leverage points. Now let's overlay today onto the 4-stage pattern with audit language, because this is what makes the script feel like a revelation instead of a rant. The U.S. has a forward posture across the region designed for deterrence and rapid response. Check. Commitments have multiplied across overlapping theaters, requiring continuous readiness and political justification. Verified. The global economic substrate is heavily leveraged, making shock management more urgent and credibility more costly to lose. Verified. Iran is signaling retaliation against U.S. bases if attacked, while tensions also affect maritime guidance in the Strait of Hormuz, meaning pressure points exist both on land and sea. Undeniable. The outcome is a high probability environment for escalation spirals driven by incidents, not necessarily intent. And now the final part. The warning most audiences feel but can't articulate. The pattern does not care about optimism. It does not care about, this time is different. It does not care about American exceptionalism as a magic shield. It does not care about the idea that technology will remove risk. If anything, technology accelerates the pattern. Precision weapons make fixed assets more vulnerable, and information spreads faster than diplomacy can contain. Every system believes it can outrun the bill. Rome believed it could always pay the perimeter. Weimar believed it could print stability. The 1970s world believed it could maintain an old monetary constraint while expanding obligations. And then the bill arrived. So what do you do with this, practically? First, stop consuming geopolitics like entertainment. Start tracking it like a staged system. When you see setup and overextension, you should already be scanning for crisis triggers, posture shifts, choke point alerts, diplomacy breakdowns, and statements that redefine retaliation boundaries. Second, understand exposure. Your vulnerability is often not who wins, it's volatility, energy shocks, shipping disruptions, sudden market repricing, and reactive policy decisions. And volatility is amplified in a world running at extreme leverage. Third, prepare mentally for the next headline to feel sudden to most people. Because most people track drama, you're tracking structure. And here's the direct closing warning. The stage we are entering is the one where deterrence and retaliation become mirror stories. Each side claims defense. Each side claims necessity. And because bases are both strength and liability, they become the focal point, politically, psychologically, and operationally. Iran's messaging has already placed U.S. bases into the retaliation equation if attacked. The U.S. posture remains broad, visible, and central to deterrence. Those two facts alone tell you the mechanism is active. So don't leave this to the algorithm. Subscribe, because in the next video, I'm going to show you how this machine was built step by step, why the pressure points are now exposed, and what stage 4 looks like when it stops being a warning and becomes the new normal.